Hi everybody, and welcome to my wormery. If you're wondering why I'm holding this light bulb, it's because it's my way to lead into the fact that we're doing harvesting today. And we're going to be harvesting 2 worm bins, and the light bulbs come into play because we're going to be using the light harvesting method, which uses bright lights overhead, which is used to encourage the worms to burrow down into the material, enabling us to skim off the compost from the top of the bin. So forget the old 60-watt light bulb. I've got my secret weapon. Check this out. This is a 200-watt incandescent light bulb. So it's going to go into my overhead fixture here. I break this out only once in a while for special purposes such as this, when really bright light is useful. If you look down here, we can see a couple of the items that I've got set up here. We're going to be working on 2 bins that look like this. The worms have been encouraged to move into this horizontal migration feeding zone for some time now, and those are going to get pulled out of here wholesale and placed into the new bin that's been set up for them. Cardboard in here, I've since added moisture and grit, eggshells, leaves, and a few things, cucumber, cabbage leaves, and stuff like that, to help encourage the worms to stay within the bin and feel well fed. So adding a little bit of coffee here as well. So there's not much left to do here other than add the worms. 27 is the age of these bins now. 27 weeks since they went into service. Last week was an anniversary, a 6-month anniversary for these bins. Thing that I've not done in some time now is I've not used my sifter. My sifter has kind of a mesh material on it, so that as I collect the compost, I can run it through this in order to capture any larger particles. That's the one thing about this, is that I kind of late in the game added things such as an entire pumpkin, resulting in a bunch of pumpkin seeds that I've not broken down, and other things that are scattered throughout this material are pistachio shells. My intent is to capture all those larger items and put them back into the feeding zone of the new bin. Now, as far as compost only is concerned, it won't be compost only, because it'll have a lot of straggler worms, little tiny baby worms that might have snuck through the screen, and it'll also probably include a lot of worm eggs, worm cocoons. So the second part of that is the compost is going to go into this larger size bin here, and within this bin the nearly finished compost will be baited. So I'll be setting up sort of a bait container, similar to what I store my coffee in, except it'll have perforations around the side that would allow the worms to get into it. So it'll rest within the compost material, and it'll have stuff inside that the worms are attracted to: bedding, food, things of that nature, all kinds of savory things that are going to draw the attention of the worms, baby worms as they hatch, straggler worms that made it through the sifting process, so that I can extract them easily and then hopefully be left with compost only in the end. So why don't I get this big light bulb installed into the overhead fixture. I'll get a glove on, and then I'll be ready to begin. Okay, I've got my glove on, so it's lights. Ooh, baby, that's bright. Camera and action. So, like I said, the main focus of this first part is going to be to clear out this space that's got the worms in it and introduce them to their new home. So I'll do that by creating a little bit of a divot on one side, and then I'll just create another divot on the other side when the worms from the other bin are introduced. I'm just going to create a little bit of an overlap here just so that I don't make a mess on the table as this occurs. So the bright lights are not really needed yet, but they're good for the camera for good exposure. But all we're going to do now is sort of depopulate this section of the bin as is. So that means any of the food that they've not yet broken down, any of the bedding that's still in here with them, and just going to see what we can see as we work our way through. Obviously some castings are going to sneak through as well, which is fine, it's not a problem at all. It's a fair bunch of worms right there. I think here in the middle is where we're gonna, I can feel them, they're grabbing onto each other. Oh boy, easy, easy fellas. See, a lot of the stuff that they've been working into compost already is nice material here. I think some of this material is sneaking by here as well. Big bunch of worms here. All right, you know, so the rest of this I'm going to leave it for the screening process. Good, we're off to a nice start here. So let's just see how this first batch of worms from this bin look. They look really nice. There's a fair number of them in here already. And we'll get to the business of screening this material. All right. I'm going to begin by trying to move the material to one side as much as I can and sort of stack it up on the far side of the bin. Alright, so now this light harvesting process does depend on time, obviously. You do need time for the worms to be able to retreat down into the material. So I'm going to give this a few minutes just to allow the worms to burrow down a little bit. And then I'm going to begin with the sifting of the material off the top. This is something I've never used before. I watched it in a YouTube video where somebody else was doing their light harvesting and they were using a paintbrush to help scrape the material off the top. And I felt that that was a really smart idea, because in the past I've always used my fingers, and it seems like with this you can do a real gentle sweep along the top. And in doing so, you can, I think, better control not scooping worms along with each pass. It just seemed like a good thing to try, and it seems to be working quite well. So here, I'll usually quickly inspect the material just to see if any straggler worms did actually get swept over in the process. And then all I'm doing is placing it into the sifter here, and then once I reach a certain amount, I'll go ahead and give that a quick shake so that the nice finished vermicompost will drop down into the bucket, and then I can just reclaim all these larger particles. So this is working out pretty good so far. I like the results I'm seeing. Paintbrush also does a great job picking up all this fine material out of these crevices in the bottom of the bin. Cleaning the compost by sifting it through. So here's what I've got. It's not a whole bunch, so I'll usually do little amounts, and you can already see some of the fine material has fallen through the screen and is down in the bucket already. And since my material is fairly dry, it shouldn't take too much effort to just jostle it around a bit. Help some of the compost break loose of some of the pistachio shells and other material that's in here. But here again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but this is kind of what we're after. We're after a separation of this larger material that still needs to be broken down and put back into an active worm bin, separated from the smaller particles, which is going to be treated for the most part like finished compost. You can see small things have made their way in there, tiny pumpkin seeds and things like that. I'm not worried that much about it in terms of coming up with a perfectly clean finished product. I've got my little collection bin here. I'll just empty it out every so often, and then all the stuff that we collect in this fashion is just going to go right back into an active worm bin. All right. There's no doubt about it, this is most certainly a very time-consuming effort. So you need a lot of patience. Certainly need a lot of patience if you're going to set out to do something like this. But I think it reinforces the thinking in my head, at least, in terms of better planning when it starts getting closer and closer to the time for harvesting your compost, or maybe even earlier on, in terms of just thinking about the sort of things you're going to attempt to put into your bin. You know, if you know that you're going to be putting stuff like pistachio shells into your worm bins, then you're either going to have to commit to an extremely long period of time to allow those types of materials to get broken down by the worms, or you're just going to have to accept the fact that a process like this is going to be needed to pull those things out of your compost if they haven't been broken down yet. So I think that's just that's the sort of stuff I'm going to be keeping in mind in the future, because if you've watched any of my videos, you'll usually see that the foods that I feed the worms are usually kind of vegetable matter, stuff that was left over from the kitchen, and I'm not even certain how stuff like pistachio seeds and whatnot got into this material, but it's all besides the fact. The bottom line is, if you want easy harvesting and you want it to be such that the worms can simply do it for you by moving out of the finished compost, then you want to make sure that you feed them with materials that that are easy for them to consume in its entirety, so as to not be left with material that needs this high degree of attention. you know, it's not this part of it that takes long. It's the part it's the intermediate part where you want to allow time for these worms on the surface to burrow down enough so they can scrape off the next layer. So, and I guess what I'm expecting at the end is that this right here, once all the compost has been scraped off the top, is that's going to be just a lump of worms. But it's also leading me to believe that I can take a different approach and end up with similar results. And I decided that I'm just going to complete this bin this way, just so we could see how many worms we end up with here, since we're so close to the finish line at this point. But the other bin, I've decided that for the other bin, I'm just going to run all that material straight through the sifter. You know, naturally I'm going to take the worms out of their feeding zone that they're in right now. But as far as doing the light separation and using the light to encourage the worms to burrow down, and then trying to keep them separate from the compost, I'm not going to bother with this. So all I'm going to do with the second bin is run it through the sifter as is, and my only objective is going to be to remove the particulate matter, the large chunks of uncomposted food from the material. And then whether the worms wind up with that uncomposted food, which is fine, because they'll just end up in the they'll just end up back in an active bin once I reintroduce that food to an active bin again. Or if the worms go through the sieve and they end up in the compost itself, I don't really think it matters, because ultimately I'm going to give the finished compost an opportunity to depopulate anyway for all the unhatched worms that are still in cocoons, and for any of the tiny worms that just slip through the sieve along with the compost. So I think that's going to be the best way to bring this to closure. Otherwise, I'm in for a couple more hours of this, and it's going to just occupy way too much of my time, way more than I had expected. So I'm really just, you know, bringing closure to it this way, just out of curiosity to see how many worms are really going to be left at the bottom of this pile once I finish scraping off all the material. You begin to see a little sense of it over here already. A lot of worms visible, mainly because we're probably just running out of room for them to burrow into at this point. So I really don't have a sense of exactly how many worms to expect in there. That's what I'm most curious of. But it will give you a sense of what it takes to do it this way, if you were to decide that this was the way for you. You know, I think this is one of the main reasons I decided to kind of transition to a different method, where you kind of basically let the worms do all the work. But it's not a big deal. It's all good. Just that I'm kind of running out of time. I'm gonna have to go to the airport tonight, and I still haven't eaten anything today, so I'm getting very hungry. So it's part of the reason I'm interested in kind of bringing this to drawing to a close with this already. But in the past, I've always gotten like a huge lump of worms at the bottom of a pile like this after working it down, doing this light harvesting method. So I was just curious to see how many worms I can remove. But the other difference here is that I have already removed 2 batches of worms using just the horizontal migration method. So that batch of worms from a month ago to start off that bin that's on the shelf, and then immediately prior to starting this, we took out that second batch of worms. So I'm inclined to believe that the number of worms remaining in that compost is probably minimal. So it might just be all for nothing more than satisfying my curiosity. So maybe the best bet at this point is to simply wrap up. Let's just take a closer look at how this pile is populated anymore. Why don't we just peel back some of it and see what we're left with. See, right here. In fact, I could probably pull away a huge amount of minimally occupied material here. And then probably what we're left with in the end here is a pretty good hunk of worms. Yeah, there we go. It's kind of what I was curious of, is just to sort of get a sense of how many worms would have still remained in this material if we were to just separate in this fashion. So you can see it's a fair number of worms. I mean, just kind of rolling the ball of worms around is one way also to just separate all these castings from them. Got a pretty good number of them. Now naturally, if we just take all the contents of the other bin and sift through the finished compost material rapidly, just to take out the large particles of food matter, then there will be no lump of worms like this. There will be no opportunity for them to retreat to one particular space. So I might only capture little tiny bits and pieces of that process, since there won't be a real grand finale like on this one to see a big pile of worms in the end. And here too, you can see a number of worms just don't make it through the sieve, so they're easy enough to just grab and pull them out of the sifter. But you know, this may have just been more for the purposes of demonstrating at this point, since functionally it's not achieving much, since the same net effect is going to be had either way. So maybe the best thing to do at this point is to stop torturing these little guys with all this bright light and go ahead and drop them into the new bin, just so they can relax finally, right? That would be the nice humane thing to do with these little guys. I'll just go ahead and take these little guys and drop them into their new home. Awesome. Now while they're doing their thing, here's the amount of reclaimed, uncomposted stuff, mostly pistachio shells. I believe a lot of this is the shells from chestnuts, a whole bunch of pumpkin seeds, most of the things that we were easily able to identify along the way. It's got to amount to at least a couple pounds of stuff. You can see it's a fair volume as well. So my guess is that we're going to end up with a similar amount of stuff in the by sifting through the other bin. And as far as vermicompost is concerned, the bucket is, I would say, about 2/3 of the way full. But you can see the material's really nice and fine. It's not perfect. A lot of little stuff that fell through the sieve is in here. And that's fine, you know. It'll go into the garden. It'll be rich with some additional organic matter. Starting to have a change of heart in terms of using that large bin. So I was actually considering just reusing the bin that these little guys were in previously. What I did was I took the collected compost and I dumped it back into the bin that the worms, the whole shebang was in before we harvested. And you can see it's almost overflowing here. The material is bulging over the top of the rim of the container, and it's spilling past what I would consider to be the halfway point. So it seems to me that it's not an option to try to use one bin like this this way. It's going to be leveled down now to see how much there is in here, if it's all just laying flat within the bin. It's pretty good. And then one of these empty boxes is what I had intended to create the bait zone with. 20 holes in this, which will allow the worms to get in now. If there's any worms that are going to be hatching from their cocoons or from their eggs, or any worms that snuck into the compost through the screen, the aim is to convince them to make their way into this bait box. I'm going to have just to have a little bit of cardboard on the bottom, a little bit of damp cardboard. A piece of cabbage leaf. Jam that in there, nice and stinky. Piece of the cabbage stem, I guess, in the middle. A cucumber. So I'm just going to cut this in half so the other half can be used for the other bait bomb. And on top of all that, we're just going to put a little bit of a leaf cover. Let's grab a handful of leaves, stuff it on top. And I'm just going to position this in the center of the bin, right there. And then we'll just backfill it, and that's that. Just level it off here a little bit. It's pretty much what I was after. I'm going to allow plenty of time for this material to depopulate. And we will check in on the bait once in a while just to see if we're gathering worms. We'll cover this up as well just to keep the moisture levels in the box. Now, just to start restoring some order to the table here, another thing that we had decided to do was to not use this clear bin as the new worm bin. So I figured take care of that right now as well. So I've decided to go with the larger, taller bin. Let's see how we can do that without making a huge mess. I think being quick about it is one of the best ways to avoid creating a big mess. So I'm just going to go on the count of 3 and flip it right over. 1, 2, 3. And just want to dislodge any of the material that's still stuck to the bottom of this bin here. The main reason for doing this is because I just want the extra real estate in this bin. Much more room in here than there was in the other bin. I can definitely see some of the worms that we moved over earlier are congregated still in certain spots. Actually, it looks like they stayed together in a big jumble over here. A bunch of them over here as well. But for now, let's get this out of the way as well. Now we can get back to the business of finishing off sister bin number 2. The general arrangement here is sifter, and before we sift, I almost forgot, we're going to be taking the worms from the horizontal migration of this bin and putting them into the new bin as well. So I almost forgot about that step, so let's take care of that first. try to minimize the stuff flying all over the place. Well, maybe not. We'll just do a little bit at a time then. I'll take some of them here. There's some of the cantaloupe that they were chewing on previously. Let's move some of this cardboard aside for now. Fair number of worms here too. Very nice. A fair amount of cardboard in here, maybe more than I need. So I'll just let these worms retreat, and maybe I'll fish some of the cardboard out. It's a good example though, right? They love to crawl in between those openings in the cardboard. This piece of cardboard delaminated, but you can see that they were right inside of it. I guess they like that nice cozy feeling of being inside in between those layers. So I'll just leave these guys out here for a little while so that they disappear down into the material. Here we got a whole bunch more. I just wonder if, oh wow, look at that, right in between the layers even more. They really love being in between the layers of the cardboard. How do you like that? Let's see if we can find more. There's another piece of cardboard. Maybe they're in between the layers of this too. Yep, that is so cool. Maybe here too, another, yep, a couple more. Maybe I won't peel all of it apart just so they've got some remaining places like that to hang out since they enjoy it so much. I don't want to mess it all up. Maybe I could just spread this stuff to be sort of a top layer. Some of this stuff isn't really corrugated like that, it's just flat cardboard. But for now, I think it's time we proceed with emptying out the other sister bin. Let's get to work on that. I've been seeing cocoons all day, but I've really not drawn any attention to any of them, so I just keep them in there and they'll hatch up. They'll hatch in time. All right, let's get to work. All right, so we won't be using the brush for this. I'll just be grabbing handfuls and proceeding as planned. So I guess since this large uncomposted material is going to also include a bunch of worms, that's fine, because it will simply be added back to the in-service bin. So why don't I flip this? We'll focus our attention on the material that's on this side of the bin. Luckily we're near the end. Maybe one or two more siftings and we're there. Okay, and this should be the end of it. casting material out of here. What a workout. So now, like we did earlier, we're just going to take the finished compost material and transfer it back into this bin. Let's see how much it adds up to. So as far as the container is concerned, I would say it's around the same amount, height-wise. There's going to be a lot more worms in here than there were previously, but that's fine since we are setting up the bait bomb for them to be lured into. A couple chunks here. Stuff breaks apart really nice and easy. And certain things made their way through, but it's fine. Little stems of leaves, things like that. All right, great. Now we have to prepare another lure for them. And I've got another box like before. So we'll just create another one. Cardboard, wet cardboard on the bottom. Food items, the cabbage leaves, the cabbage stem, and the cucumber. Good stuff. Just going to top it off with some leaves, like we did earlier. All right. And now all we need to do is create a space for it here in the middle. So let's just start to backfill the sides of the container. And we'll just shake it around and see how it looks. Cocoons everywhere. Now, we're almost finished. Obviously there's going to be a bunch of cleanup here, which I won't bore you with, but the final thing that we still need to do is put all that reclaimed uncomposted material that we took out of those two bins and put it back into our in-service bin. I'm just gonna go ahead and treat the middle of the bin as the feeding space. All right, that should be enough space. This is a lot of stuff. Wow, actually a lot more stuff than I expected. It's crazy. Well, just gonna, this is a very food-rich bin. I really don't see the need to feed this thing anytime soon, that's for sure. But you know me, I'll be adding food in no time. Just go ahead and start spreading some of this cardboard back out across the top. How do you like that? We're finally done many hours later. This was quite a feat, quite a job, I must say. And I'm still not done because I've still got to clean up this mess, right? So I won't bore you with any of that. Let me finish with a thank you. Thank you for sitting through and keeping me company during this little project. And hopefully we all learned a little something. To me, the important thing, the important lesson here is the ability to adapt. You know, so if you encounter certain circumstances and you know, you don't like where it's going, you prefer to try to steer it to a certain way, you know, you should always feel like you can kind of switch on the fly and adapt to your situation and not get pigeonholed into a situation that doesn't really suit your needs. So, all right, everyone, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up if you did. Also consider becoming a subscriber. That's always appreciated too. And ring the little bell too. If you hit the bell, then you'll get notified whenever I put out new content like this if you enjoyed it. So thanks again for watching, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.